But at the end of the day, I have found the fastest access to culture is the conversations that the people in the organization are having between each other. And you could really even think of culture as a network of conversations.
Welcome to Season 3 of Leadership Impact, the podcast for modern executives who are reinventing leadership within their organizations, with your host, Executive Leadership Coach and CEO of the Granger Network, Kari Granger, and me, Paul Adams, CEO of Sound Financial Group. This season focuses on trust. This is episode 39, How Culture Spiraled Out of Control.
Welcome back to Leadership Impact, episode 4 today, How Cultures Spiral Out of Control. And of course, we are talking about the culture of distrust. So, Paul, I think today we're going to take a look and recognize the way every day, unintentionally, we can easily undermine our desire to have a trusting culture and contribute to this negative spiral.
And I think you've talked about it before as it being a business imperative. And I think as we get into this idea of what is distrust as an organization and breaking that cycle, is that it's as important of a cycle to break as, I would say, somebody, even though this would be an untrustworthy thing, somebody embezzling money. Because it is robbing your company of important productivity and performance, and is oftentimes just dealt with as this is something every organization deals with. There's politics inside. People don't quite fully trust each other with their careers, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, well, you got to think about it. Like, if people are knee-deep in cynicism and defensiveness and secrecy and gossip and, inauthentic, disingenuous conversations, and this is not good for your bottom line.
Yes. Well, and you say distrust very intentionally. Perhaps for our listeners, could you just share, why is it you say distrust and not trusting?
Yeah, I think distrust, there's an activeness about that. It's not just that I don't trust you, it's that I don't trust you. It's like a mood of distrust even. And when I have a mood of distrust, that's contagious. It's all over. When I have a mood of distrust, my actions are consistent with not trusting.
Yes. And everything you see is going through the filter of not trusting. And then I would imagine if you have distrust in an organization, you do trust exercises, which joked a little bit about trust falls, is that it's not doing anything because we didn't do anything to disrupt the existing cycle.
Right. Yeah. So it's not even neutral. It's negative, and that's why I say distrust. It's not like an absence of trust. It's an active distrust.
So I would just ask, where do our listeners start?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple kind of building blocks to this conversation. One is, as we've continuously looked at all organizations, all people, I don't want to know if I should say all, but let's just say 99.999 will agree that trust is a good thing and we'd like to have trust. Okay. And at the same time, they don't necessarily know how to get their hands on trust. Well, here's how to get your hands on trust. You ready?
Yes.
Yeah. Trust is built, it's sustained, it's maintained through conversations. Yeah. Now let's go a little bit further with that. When we look at a relationship, we can see that trust is built or destroyed through the kinds of conversations that we have or we don't have. Between you and me, Paul, say you do something. It's not the action necessarily that you do, but it's what happens after the action. Do I interpret your action as distrusting and stop talking to you? Or do I come back to you, Paul, and I say, hey, I didn't love that action. It's not consistent with our relationship. Can we take a look at that? So the building of trust is happening in the conversation or the non-conversation.
And what I noticed about the second way you could have responded to me is it actually was a new, going back to our last episode, a small extension of trust again to try to rebuild trust even in that conversation. So given that distrust cycles are in conversation, what are the kinds of words people might be hearing travel around their organization that gives them a hint that, there might actually, I thought maybe we need to just increase trust, but we might actually have a cycle of distrust.
Yeah. And I think mostly you're going to find that in the moods. There's a mood of cynicism, or there's an automatic assessment that management doesn't care about us. You hear it in the moods and you hear it in the automatic interpretations people have about the different events in their organization's life. So, I have a client that I've worked with over the years, and they're what I might call a high change organization.
Mm-hmm.
And in the years in which a mood of distrust has prevailed, every change has been met with cynicism, skepticism, it's second guessing, doubting. And when they have a mood or a culture of trust, every change is met with different language like curiosity, ambition. This is a new iteration. We're a high agile organization. So they've had changes, but what's been different is kind of the prevailing mood of trust or distrust. Let's go back to your first question, which is, how do you get your hands on this thing? How do you get your hands on culture, this atmosphere, this glue? Well, many people look at culture, if you look at Edgar Schein's work, there's primary things and secondary things, and they look at things like, what are the stories that are told, or what's the vision, or what are the artifacts, and you can get your hands on these discrete pieces. But at the end of the day, I have found the fastest access to culture is the conversations that the people in the organization are having between each other. And you could really even think of culture as a network of conversations.
And maybe for our folks that are maybe a little more techie, that network of conversations is almost like, it doesn't matter what machine it's running on, it's going to produce that culture, that those conversations are going to produce a culture of distrust, regardless of what organization they're in, or trust. Yes. Yeah.
So it's the conversations happening between the members. The web, you could even say a web of conversations.
Yes.
The conversation, the cumulative of the conversations that are happening between the members of the organization that make up the culture. So going back to what we were talking about, if Paul, you're in my conversation is one in which distrust is prevailing, we've gotten into our own little cycle of distrust, which we haven't talked about yet, but you did something, I distrust you, now you're observing my reaction to you, and now you distrust me, and our mood and the assessments we have about each other and the kinds of conversations we're having is one that kind of has begun to spiral into distrust. I become shorter with you, you become, sharper with me. Then because you've been sharper with me, I become defensive with you, which makes you defensive and protective and attacking. And we just kind of spiral into this, hole of distrust. And now, do I just keep that between you and me at work? No. Yeah, no. I go and I talk to Sherry, who I happen to, have coffee with a couple times here and there. And, maybe I just came out of conversation. I'm like, golly, Paul, he's like, he's so defensive. He just he always is kind of like passive aggressive with me all the time. And it's not just Paul, it's the entire marketing team. Now I've just introduced a conversation into our culture that starts to have Sherry. There's a little tinge of a mood of distrust, either with me,
yes,
unlikely,
yes,
or with you guys as marketing.
You, because you're sharing about that with somebody else who can't do anything about it. So if she's an astute observer, she's going to trust you less. And if she's
unlikely,
not as astute of an observer,
right?
Which for our entire audience, Kari and I are in great shape. She did not just give you a something going on right now. Only
message?
an example.
No. Yes.
Yeah, we just barely get along except for the show. So, but then the flip side is that you also could be introducing distrust for me in that organization, because then I'm wondering, why is Sherry different now with me?
Right. So now Sherry's going to start interacting with you different, which has you be like, man, all the women in this organization are whatever, right? Or, man, I can't get a break, or all management is this way, right? So now you're going to go back to your people and talk about the category that includes Kari and Sherry. Because we're a web of conversations, it can just go so fast. So, you think about a big change coming down, and if I have a negative mood and assessment that I say out loud to you, it's not just between you and me. And I promise you, I am in the domain of human performance, and people do not keep things to themselves, like ever. And especially if somebody comes to you and says, don't tell anybody, but you can promise, or you can count on the fact that they say that to other people. Right? So it's just like, it's human nature to share. Like my profession as a coach, we have to keep things highly confidential. It is hard. We have to practice and practice and practice and practice. And I have like things in front of me that's just like, there's an ethical practice, but it takes training.
Yes.
People in the profession of confidentiality have to have like serious training about this. It's not normal human being behavior. Right? So it can, these cycles of distrust, it just spirals. It's like an infectious disease. It's so contagious.
So I have one where we had this in an organization I was leading. And this is just telling one on myself, because what I tried to do when I saw it going around is I tried to teach people about how gossip is not a good part of the organization. We define gossip as saying something about someone or something to someone that couldn't do anything about it anyway.
Okay. Is it negative?
Yeah, if it's a negative thing about the person or something to someone that couldn't do anything to fix it. And what I realize as you're saying this now is that I went after the symptom. The root cause was some people on the team had distrust for each other, and I went after the gossip. I put in our company values we wouldn't gossip.
Yeah.
I herald it week after week in some fairly transformative trainings, and it worked a little bit. But what I fundamentally had is a group of about 5 folks working for me that didn't trust each other. And then the rest of the organization had to tolerate this conversation about gossip that didn't affect them because they weren't doing it anyway.
Yeah.
And so there's just what I just had dropped on me was like an anvil of truth. And having gone through and addressed a symptom of distrust and not having known at that time that what I needed to address was the distrust.
Distrust, not the gossip. Yeah.
Yes.
So let's talk about what Paul could have done, because I know people are saying, yes, I see this. Now, what do I do about it?
I say we end the episode right here. And then we'll just tell them at the beginning of the next episode, Kari.
That's so mean. That will create.
Okay. I know you won't want to do that to our audience. I would do it to them in a second. I would love to keep all of you in suspense, but Kari's going to take good care of you guys here.
So what is it then to begin to go after distrust? In your example, I think what could have Paul done differently is to stop and begin to inquire into the gossip. Use the gossip as an opening to inquire further, into the distrust, right? So, hey, share with me, I'm hearing this gossip, or I'm hearing what you're saying. What's going on? What happened that's giving you concern? Right. Now, why this could work here is because he's going to take the gossip seriously as a symptom of a root cause. And he's not going to just tolerate gossip. And he's not going to tell people not to gossip, but he's going to leverage it as an access point to something that's happening.
And 1, I didn't do that. 2, what people tried to do was hide the gossip. I watched that.
Because you're not allowed to do it.
Yes. And now I didn't get a chance to inquire. So the very thing that could have been giving me information as a leader that I could inquire into, like a trail to follow, instead put me in the position that I actually was squashing down the symptoms that were giving me information about my culture.
Yeah, really good. Now, I don't always say, in fact, I only started saying this a couple years ago.
Are you going to always say it going forward?
But I'm always going to say it going forward, that especially if it's in a really big organization is kind of overwhelming and too much to take on the culture of the whole thing by yourself, right? But you can always begin with something called our local culture. Okay, so a local culture, like maybe it is the marketing team within a larger organization, or maybe it's the Seattle branch of the marketing team within the large, right? But our local culture, the 5 or 10 people around me might be where I start, right? And maybe it even starts with 3 people around me, depending on where I am. Then it begins to grow to 10. Maybe it begins to grow to 20. And why this works is because that our local cultures add up to impact the greater culture. So I know that people in Seattle, every once in a while, talk to the people in Houston. So if you start to impact one person in Houston, that person, remember, it's a web of conversations. So that person's conversations begin to shift. So our access point to shifting culture is through the webs of conversations. So you're not going to try to change a person. You're going to try to change the conversation.
And because it's a web of conversations, and you mentioned local culture, I want to share with you what I'm interpreting that to mean, and then let me know and our audience if I'm off. But I would also seem to take that to mean that if there's a team that I'm working within, the people I'm in most regular conversation with, and that team could be spread all over a country.
Could. Yeah.
And I'm just going to interact with that team, and I'm going to start with my team that's local to me, which is not a geographic locality, but a locality in the network of conversations.
Exactly. So think about it I think just in my small company, right? I think if I have a conversation with somebody on the delivery team, every once in a while, well, I would not even every once in a while, some of them have regular weekly conversations with somebody in our digital team, right? And so I didn't even say anything to somebody on our digital team, but I will hear it come out of the digital team's mouth.
Because the way you communicated generated new thinking and became catalytic through the network.
Or it can generate reinforcing. Whatever you say matters to the culture. And we often don't understand that. We don't know that when we say, even my local family culture, my husband and I have been working hard, both of us, right? And yesterday, my daughter came up. She's like, "Oh, I'm so exhausted. I woke up at 6:08. I was like, that's a weird thing for a 5-year-old to say.
Yes.
Especially one that likes to wake up at like 5, right? I'm like, that was our local culture, was like exhaustion. So that's how humans kind of work when we're together, is we talk, right? So let's leverage that to shift that cycle of distrust. First is to notice, what conversations need to happen, right? So noticing, man, I'm in this cycle with somebody, or I see these people are in this cycle. Let's address this. Let's open a window of trust. Let's have some real conversations about the root issue and see if we can begin to shift the narrative. That can happen through new commitments. It can happen by, demonstrating a real validation and understanding of what's happening. Really don't make a mistake thinking that, that's just those two's problem and it's not impacting the rest of the organization. So if we can begin to shift the conversations, just even one by one, eventually it will tip over.
Kari, that is spot on. And I think it's a perfect place for us to wrap, because what people are hearing is that, number one, we have to listen to the conversations in our current organization. We need to understand if those are distrustful or not, and begin to introduce, really piggybacking on the last episode as well, new conversations to the people that are in our local culture. It's totally within our control to begin to extend some trust. And we really push out, it sounds like, that distrust, not by squashing its symptoms like my mistake has been in the past, but by extending pieces of trust, taking it under our control as individuals, and then begin to shift the organization from those people with whom we're in the greatest conversation with, that you call that local culture.
And next episode, we should talk about the difference between authentic conversations and dialogue and faking it. You can't fake it.
Wow. So that's where we're going to go next episode, is how do we make sure that we're not faking it in the way that we're trying to be authentic in our trust in leadership, which seems like that would be the quickest way to undermine it. So I'm looking forward to that one. And for everyone else listening, We hope that you take this and make some practical steps. Share this episode with somebody. Share a cup of coffee. Discuss the episode and see what happens. Begin to shift that culture, identify distrust. And Kari, anything else you'd like to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, this is really, really simple. Is look for yourself where you might be in a cycle of distrust and begin to have a new conversation. Like, where could you begin to have a new conversation? That's really the most simple place to start.
Very good. So take that with you this week. Identify one place today where you can have a new conversation. And we hope that this has been a contribution to your leadership impact. Thank you for tuning into Leadership Impact, the podcast for modern executives who are reinventing leadership within their organizations. Subscribe now at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.